Britain would be permanently poorer if we left the European Union. Under any alternative, we'd trade less, we'd do less business, there would be less investment, and the price would be paid by British families. Wages would be lower, prices would be higher, and that means that Britain would be poorer by £4,300 per household. That is £4,300 worse off every year, a bill paid year after year by the working people of Britain.
So, the UK government has released its latest 200-page dodgy dossier as part of the Remain establishment camp's fear campaign on the forthcoming EU referendum. The Chancellor George Osborne has led the charge of the Light Brigade by publishing a report that concluded that leaving the EU would cost the UK potential future GDP growth of 6.2% per annum by 2030 in relative terms, i.e. if that Brexit happened, annual GDP, while still growing, would be 6% lower by 2030 if Britain had chosen to remain within the EU. The Treasury went further to give a figure in terms of the annual cost to the average household of £4,300, which implies that the average household earns about £69,000 per annum, i.e. if you divide 4,300 by 6.2% and times by 100, then you get 69k. According to the ONS, average household income is just 45k. So what is the extra 24k difference? Well, that's why it's called a dodgy dossier. That just does not add up. The first gaping hole with the government propaganda is that the government cannot even forecast accurately 12 months forward, let alone 14 years. For instance, a year ago, the UK government was forecasting to grow in 2016 by 2.6%, whilst today that has been cut to 2% with 9 months to go. And secondly, that the UK Treasury is forecasting the impact on total GDP rather than GDP per capita, because the Treasury model has another 14 years of out of control immigration built into its calculation, whereas leaving the EU would result in far less immigration and hence higher per capita GDP. For instance, if net immigration fell to 100,000 per year against the present trend towards 400,000 per annum, then that would amount to a population difference of 4.2 million, or about 6.5%, which on its own completely demolishes the claims of the government's dodgy dossier, all without considering any of the positive economic consequences of Brexit, such as bringing down immigration, which the dodgy dossier doesn't even touch. Furthermore, if the same formula were used to calculate the loss of potential GDP, i.e. the difference in GDP if the banking crash and bailouts had never happened, that the taxpayers were forced to fund to the tune of £500 billion via the Bank of England, and then taking on £4 trillion of banking sector liabilities that resulted in the Great Recession, which saw GDP slump by 5% by mid-2009, coupled with a collapse in interest rates that still persists to this very day. So initial collapse in GDP of 5% is a permanent ongoing annual loss of output, i.e. for the next 22 years from 2008 to 2030. So the starting point is that GDP in 2030 is going to be 5% below potential. Secondly, the continuing bailout of the banking system by means of zero interest rates and QE, with signs that rates may even go negative so as to allow the customer bank deposits to be stolen, then this continuing banking system support cost Britain an estimated 1% loss of GDP per year, i.e. each year's growth on average tends to be 1% below potential that compounds. For instance, this year the UK will likely grow by just 1.6% against potential of 2.5%. In fact, the Bank of England was forecasting 2.5% growth, but as has been the case for virtually every year since 2008, tends to cut the forecast as reality dawns. the net effect being a persistent 1% underperformance every year that feeds through to the following year. This 1% underperformance over 22 years converts into a huge difference in potential of 11%. Therefore, the total actual potential cost to the British economy as a consequence of bailing out the banking crime syndicate is approximately 16%, which is many multiples of the UK Treasury estimate of the potential loss of just 6%. And again, this does not take into account any of the positive impacts in terms of per capita output, as there would be approximately 4.2 million less hungry migrant mouths to feed settling in the UK by 2030 that would otherwise be the case. And if I follow the UK Treasury's conversion of the percentage into impact on household income at the same rate, then this converts into a loss to every household of £11,096 by 2030 every year. That is the real cost of Britain's insidious banking crime syndicate who most of the politicians serve, and which I warned at the time in 2008 in numerous articles that ordinary people would end up paying the price for the banking crime syndicate bailouts for a decade to come. However, the bottom line is that freedom always carries a price. So Brexit will carry a cost, but that cost is unlikely to result in a permanent loss of GDP, i.e. my consistent analysis has concluded that Brexit would likely cost between 2% to 5% of GDP per annum for the first 5 years or so following a Brexit, which will be followed by a period of outperformance and thus result in GDP per capita being at least 6% higher in relative terms by 2030. The bottom line is that the people of Britain need to fully understand that this really is their very last chance for freedom. So do subscribe to this YouTube channel for new videos and check out my other videos on the forthcoming EU referendum, including my facts checking of the Conservative government's propaganda leaflet.